What if the Cuban Missile Crisis went nuclear? Picture a midnight ocean, black water, blacker sky, and somewhere in that darkness, a Soviet submarine is breathing shallow and hot. Above, American destroyers are circling, dropping practice depth charges like an impatient heartbeat. On shore, phones are ringing in the White House and the Kremlin. A U-2 spy plane has just fallen from the sky, and in bunkers across 2 continents, hands hover over keys that could turn cities into suns. That was October 27, 1962, Black Saturday, the day the world brushed the edge of extinction and somehow pulled back. But if one choice went differently, if one man and one submarine nodded yes instead of no, our entire map changes. Not just borders, the seasons, the sky. Let's rewind. What really happened? In early October 1962, American reconnaissance photos revealed Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba, medium and intermediate range variants that could deliver warheads to Washington, to New York, to the heart of the United States in minutes. The Kennedy administration responded with a naval quarantine, a blockade by any other name, tightening a ring of steel around the island. For 13 days, the world held its breath. Messages pinged between President John F. Kennedy and Premier Nikita Khrushchev, some angry, some pleading, some contradictory. Soviet ships hesitated on the horizon. American bombers loaded up. The Pentagon raised DEFCON levels to 2. Then Black Saturday, a U-2 was shot down over Cuba. Another U-2 strayed into Soviet airspace over the Arctic. In the Caribbean, Soviet submarine B-59, hunted and deaf in the warm water, was forced to surface. Its captain, Valentin Savitsky, convinced that war had begun. In reality, it hadn't. But on board was a special weapon, a nuclear torpedo. According to Soviet procedure, 3 officers had to agree to fire. 2 said yes. 1, Vasily Arkhipov, said no. His refusal kept the world from changing forever. Historically, diplomacy broke through the panic. The Soviets pulled their missiles out of Cuba. Quietly, the Americans later removed missiles from Turkey. Kennedy promised not to invade Cuba. The world exhaled. But what if Arkhipov wasn't there? Or what if he hesitated just 1 second longer? We follow the smallest spark. In our alternate timeline, the sea is louder. The heat inside B-59 climbs. The crew is exhausted, shaken, and blind. Signals are garbled. The captain, Savitsky, convinced they've been attacked, authorizes the launch of the special weapon, a nuclear-tipped torpedo aimed at a U.S. carrier escort in the quarantine line. The torpedo leaves the tube, a white trail rising to an apocalyptic flash. On the surface, sailors look at a growing column of water and light and know instantly what has happened. Washington hears first as a fragmentary report, nuclear detonation at sea. The room goes quiet. The plan on the shelf, PSYOP, the single integrated operational plan, sits like a loaded gun. But Kennedy, wary of inevitability, chooses the narrow bridge. He orders immediate conventional strikes on Cuban missile sites, anti-air defenses, and airfields, seeking to decapitate the island's launch capability without crossing the nuclear threshold. It's too late to keep it local. In Cuba, Soviet officers, already living in the shadow of recent air raids, interpret the wave of jets as the opening blow of invasion. They move to fire what they can. Some missiles are destroyed on the pads. Others, shorter range, lower yield, are launched under chaos, arcing toward Florida. One detonates in the lower atmosphere above the Keys, another near Homestead Air Force Base. Panic crashes over Miami like a storm, and the American public sees the first nuclear fire of their lifetime bloom on the horizon. NATO is on hair trigger. In Europe, both alliances had war plans that assumed speed, shock, momentum, offense. As X-ray pictures of destroyed Cuban sites and rising mushroom clouds flash across war rooms, U.S. commanders authorize retaliatory strikes against Soviet forces in Cuba, while Strategic Air Command accelerates bomber dispersals. Khrushchev, facing an American assault and a torpedoed fleet, signs off on a limited retaliatory strike. American bases in Turkey are hit. A NATO airfield in West Germany takes a tactical blast. The red lines on the map, once theoretical, start to bleed into one another. Now the dam breaks. Radar screens across the Arctic light up. U.S. early warning systems can't tell the difference between everything and enough. Scramble orders roar through intercoms. British V-bombers lift off. U.S. Polaris submarines begin to receive emergency codes. In Moscow, the leadership is split, some urging restraint, others shouting that delay is suicide. The logic of deterrence melts in the heat of first use. A strategic exchange follows. Not the 1980s apocalypse of thousands upon thousands of megatons, but for 1962, enough. American cities tethered to command industry and population. Washington, D.C., New York, Chicago, Detroit, Seattle, San Francisco, Los Angeles flash across the continental night. On the other side, Moscow, Leningrad, Kiev, Gorky, and key military hubs erupt in fire. London is hit. Paris is hit. Havana is obliterated. Berlin's sky ripples with overlapping blasts as both sides try to deny each other the center of Europe. The first day kills millions. The first week kills more. And then the second wave begins, quiet and pervasive. Fallout riding the wind, rain carrying invisible knives into fields, rivers, lungs. The lights, where they still work, flicker and die. High-altitude bursts fry fragile circuits across vast areas. The early, humming embryo of the electronic world suddenly stillborn. What comes next is not order, but an improvisation by a wounded planet. In the United States, continuity of government plans kick in. The president, whoever remains in the line of succession, broadcasts from a hardened site, a voice over a scratchy network telling a stunned people to shelter, to conserve water, to avoid the ash. The federal map shrinks to islands of authority, a handful of bases, some state capitals, a few cities spared by distance, luck, or irrelevance. The American West, hit but not leveled everywhere, becomes a spine of survival. Mountain towns with deep aquifers, rural counties with food caches, places where the fallout thins faster. In the Soviet Union, the losses at the top are worse. If Moscow is gutted, the Red Army becomes the country's skeleton. Regional commands taking charge, rail lines under military rule, surviving factories hammered into war for survival production. The countryside, already hard and resourceful, turns inward. Villages watching the wind and the weather like ancient oracles. Europe doesn't resemble a chessboard anymore. It's a patchwork of ash and silence and sudden activity. West Germany is a corridor of death. East Germany, too. The Low Countries, flat and dense, suffer horribly. France is wounded but not dead. Paris burned, but provincial towns stubborn. Roads policed by a mix of gendarmes and soldiers. Britain, islanded and hit, leans on its older habits. Local councils, ration books, a stiff, almost unbearable endurance. And beyond the direct blasts, the world is forced to answer a different question. What happens to the climate? Scientists of the era didn't have the language we do today, but the physics is the same. Soot from burning cities climbs into the upper atmosphere. The more that burns, the more the sun dims. It's not the full decades-long nuclear winter some models would later predict, but call it a nuclear autumn shading toward winter. 2, 3, 5 degrees off the global average, shorter growing seasons, darker midday skies. Rice in Asia struggles. Wheat in Europe struggles. Maize in the Americas struggles. Famine doesn't arrive like a single wave. It breaks, retreats, breaks again. Who steps forward in a world that's colder, poorer, and terrified? China, under Mao, is an enigma in this story. In 1962, it is not yet a nuclear power, but it is populous, hardened by disaster, and suspicious of both superpowers. Fallout doesn't respect borders, and if Siberia burns, northern winds carry poison. Still, China's interior, rural, centralized by fear and ideology, may ride out the first years with grim discipline. As the superpower poles crack, Beijing becomes a third pillar by default. Trading grain for machinery, cautious with its armies, ruthless with dissent. India becomes another unexpected center of gravity. Non-aligned by doctrine, industrial by ambition, it inherits a vacuum. Ports on the western coast become lifelines, ships carrying coal, wheat, medicines, and refugees. Delhi convenes conferences, anxious and earnest, trying to rebuild a shattered international law into something that can feed people first and punish later. In the Middle East, the oil that once drove modernity becomes both salvation and curse. Wells burn where refineries were targeted. Pipelines lie in twisted snakes across the sand. But the reserves, still there, still vast, turn regional governments into brokers of survival, trading fuel for food, medicine, technology. Cairo, if it survives, tries to revive pan-Arab dreams. Jerusalem would be quieter, surrounded by nations that suddenly have fewer resources to fight and more mouths to feed. Africa's decolonization timeline fractures. Where European metropoles are crippled, colonies and protectorates are cut loose abruptly. Some form fragile federations, others fall under the command of local officers with radios and trucks. South Africa, sitting on mineral wealth and a relatively intact industrial base, grows powerful and dangerous. Nigeria and Ghana pull in refugees. Kenya's highlands become prized breadbaskets if the rains come, and a disaster zone if they don't. Latin America reorients around a crater. Cuba is gone or uninhabitable. Caribbean currents carry ash and silence. Mexico, scarred if border bases were hit but largely intact inland, becomes a hinge between north and south, its cities swelling with survivors from Texas, from Florida, from the shattered Gulf Coast. And what about technology? What about the dreams that, in our world, soared into space barely 7 years after 1962? In this timeline, the space race doesn't stop so much as it freezes in the air, the rocket falling back toward the pad. Cape Canaveral is likely hit, or at least rendered useless by fallout and proximity to targets. Baikonur still exists, but with a shattered command chain and a starving nation behind it. Apollo is not canceled in a Senate hearing. It is canceled by a sky that's too dark to dream under. The world's best engineers turn from moonshots to survival. Water filtration, hardy crops, wind-up radios that don't need a grid. ARPA's prototypes for resilient networks, which in our world would eventually become the internet, are repurposed sooner into hardened, decentralized communications. Locally reliable, globally patchy. Culturally, the 1960s die in the cradle and are reborn as something else entirely. There's no summer of love. There is a winter of sharing, perhaps. Communes not as lifestyle, but as necessity. Folk songs still exist, but they're sung over hand-cranked turntables in basements lit by kerosene. Literature turns apocalyptic, but also pragmatic. Manuals on how to mend soil, how to set a bone, how to build a stove from scrap. Faith surges and splinters. Some see judgment, others mercy, in the fact that anything remains at all. And yet, even in this ash, people will innovate. They always do. A coastal town in Oregon builds tidal turbines from scavenged ship propellers. A Polish engineer designs a tractor that runs on wood gas. A Japanese consortium rebuilds shipyards to manufacture modular homes. An Indian scientist in Pune breeds a cold-tolerant millet that keeps a province alive. Pause here. In this alternate world, power isn't measured in gross domestic product or aircraft carriers. It's measured in calories, in clean liters of water, in the tightness of social trust. That's where new empires are forged, in cities that can keep the lights on, however dimly. Mid-roll CTA. In this nuclear alternate timeline, which unexpected region do you think would become the stabilizing anchor? India, Brazil, Australia, or somewhere most of us never considered? Share your pick below. And if you want more of these deep what-if dives, consider subscribing so you don't miss the next world we unspool. By the late 1970s in this timeline, the map is unrecognizable, but it has lines again. The Pacific Community, Japan, Australia, New Zealand, the West Coast remnants of the United States and Canada, plus a hard-working arc of Southeast Asian ports, forms a pragmatic maritime bloc. Fuel in, food out, technology traded slowly and jealously. In Eurasia, a continental union takes shape not from ideology but from geography. The pieces of the old Soviet sphere stitched together by rail over endless steppe, governed by uniforms first and technocrats later. Its capital is not Moscow, but perhaps a spared industrial city farther east, Novosibirsk or Alma-Ata, growing fat with administrators and engineers. Europe west of the Rhine becomes a mosaic of city-states and protectorates, some under the shelter of France's reconstituted force, others aligned with the British Isles if a corps survived there to offer a hand. The Americas are complicated. The eastern U.S. is a lattice of recovery zones around river valleys and viable ports. The Mountain West becomes a grain vault guarded by National Guard units that have become national by default. Canada, less targeted but downwind, becomes a colder mirror of the same pattern. Southern Ontario straining under population. The prairies becoming strategic not just for wheat, but for air bases able to connect the Pacific and Atlantic halves of a broken world. Economically, gold is less important than diesel. Dollars and rubles don't vanish, but they matter less than warehouse inventories, grain reserves, machine parts. A new expertise rises, the broker of trust. City to city, people trade not money but promises. Reputation ledgered in radio calls and stamped paper. Law follows trade. Courts are rebuilt around harbor offices and rail depots. And eventually, humans look up again. In the 1980s of this alternate history, the skies are still dimmer than ours, but the fires have burned down. One of the Pacific shipyards, let's say Kobe, rebuilt with a quiet heroism, launches a small satellite piggybacked on a refurbished sounding rocket. It blinks. It broadcasts weather data. Radios across 3 continents listen. The signal feels like a heartbeat returning after a long coma. In Europe, a university born from 3 survivors, one in Sweden, one in Scotland, one in Lyon, creates a paper that formalizes a global packet radio standard, duct-taped from ARPA's war-era ideas and ham radio ingenuity. The network starts googly-eyed small, weather, crop prices, a library of first aid manuals, and grows. There is no single United Nations in a shining city, but there is a Congress of cities that meets every few years on a safe island. Madeira, maybe, or Tahiti, where the air still smells clean and the sea is tolerable. They agree on small things that matter: disease reporting, quarantine protocols, the treatment of prisoners, the right of ships to dock for fresh water. Big politics follows sideways from small agreements. What of ideology? In our world, the Cold War was a clash of visions, of markets versus plans. In this world, survival blurs those lines. Planned economies learn to listen to farmers. Market economies learn to keep grain reserves for 3 winters, not 1. The word freedom changes shape. The word security grows softer around the edges. People want rooms that are warm and hospitals that have antibiotics. They argue about the rest in meetings that end before sunset because electricity is precious. And if you ask a child born in 1970 in this timeline whether the stars are out there for us, they will say, maybe. But first, fresh water. First, soil. It's easy from here to romanticize resilience. Don't. The cost of this alternate world is unbearable. The millions dead on day 1 are only the beginning. The long grief, lives never lived, songs never written, cures never found, spreads across decades. The absence of a global cultural explosion in the late 1960s means no cascade of rights movements as we knew them, no shared soundtrack, no moon dust on a boot to say we went together. But there is a different kind of wonder, that we survive at all, that in a world made colder by our own hands, strangers still pass bread along a line. So what if the Cuban Missile Crisis went nuclear? Power would be measured in warmth. The world's capital would be a radio frequency. The borders would be less about ideology and more about distance from ash. And the lesson would be brutal, unforgettable, and terribly human. History is not a straight path. It is a cliff's edge with footprints inching along, and sometimes the wind is stronger than we know. We didn't fall in 1962, not in our world. The ships turned, the submarines surfaced, letters were read, and sanity, fragile, embarrassed, and tired, won the day. But the fact that we can see so clearly how it could have gone otherwise should make us careful with our own edges. Because the line between a tomorrow that hums and a tomorrow that whispers can be as thin as a single word from a man in a dark, hot submarine. Yes or no.